The escalating crisis in Palestine has entered a new and volatile phase, drawing not only regional but also global powers into the spotlight. For weeks, the situation has been deteriorating, with rising civilian casualties, collapsing infrastructure, and growing fears of a prolonged humanitarian disaster. But in the past several days, the international dynamic has shifted dramatically as China and Russia stepped forward with bold statements, signaling that the conflict in Palestine is no longer a regional struggle alone, but an international flashpoint with far-reaching implications. The crisis began with renewed clashes between Israeli forces and Palestinian groups, sparking protests, demonstrations, and violent confrontations across the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. International observers had hoped that diplomacy could contain the violence, but as the weeks unfolded, it became clear that the conflict was spiraling into something much larger. The humanitarian toll has been staggering. Hospitals in Gaza are overwhelmed, struggling with shortages of medicine, electricity, and clean water. Families have been displaced in the tens of thousands, many taking shelter in temporary camps or crowded schools that have been converted into makeshift refuges. Human rights organizations describe the conditions as dire, warning that without immediate international assistance, the situation could deteriorate into a full-scale humanitarian catastrophe. Amid this turmoil, global attention has turned to the responses of the world's leading powers. The United States, long considered Israel's closest ally, has reaffirmed its support for Israel's right to defend itself, while calling for restraint and protection of civilian lives. The European Union has urged escalation, though member states remain divided over how forceful their response should be. But what has taken the world by surprise in recent days is the intervention of China and Russia, two nations with growing influence on the global stage and an increasing willingness to challenge U.S. dominance in international affairs. China's statement came first, delivered by a senior foreign ministry official in Beijing. The message was pointed and unusually direct. China condemned the violence against civilians, urged Israel to halt what it described as disproportionate military actions, and called for the immediate recognition of Palestinian statehood as a necessary foundation for peace. The Chinese government, which has traditionally positioned itself as a supporter of the Palestinian cause, took the opportunity to frame itself as a voice for justice, international law, and humanitarian concern. Officials in Beijing emphasized that China is ready to play a mediating role, offering to host peace talks between Palestinian and Israeli representatives under the umbrella of international supervision. Russia followed quickly, with the Kremlin releasing its own bold statement. Moscow accused the West of double standards, arguing that while Western nations are quick to condemn conflicts in Eastern Europe, they have turned a blind eye to the suffering of Palestinians for decades. The Russian foreign minister stated that the Palestinian people have the right to self-determination and security, and he condemned the continued occupation and expansion of settlements. Russia, like China, offered to host negotiations and called for an emergency meeting of the United Nations Security Council to address the crisis. Moscow's statement was both a critique of Western policy and a strategic move to position Russia as an indispensable actor in Middle Eastern diplomacy. The combined statements from China and Russia have reverberated across the world, adding new dimensions to an already complex crisis. Analysts point out that this intervention signals not just concern for Palestine, but also a broader geopolitical maneuver. Both Beijing and Moscow see the Palestinian issue as an opportunity to challenge U.S. influence, build alliances in the global south, and strengthen their image as defenders of oppressed peoples. For years, Washington has dominated peace negotiations in the Middle East, often criticized as being too one-sided in favor of Israel. By stepping in, China and Russia are effectively challenging that monopoly and signaling a potential realignment of international diplomacy. On the ground, the effects of these statements are already being felt. Protests in cities across the Middle East, North Africa, and South Asia have incorporated Chinese and Russian slogans into their demonstrations, praising Beijing and Moscow for standing with Palestine. In contrast, criticism of the United States and European powers has grown sharper, with many accusing Western nations of hypocrisy and selective application of human rights principles. This shift in global sentiment is significant. For decades, Palestinians have looked to the Arab world and Western advocacy groups for support. Now, the entry of China and Russia into the debate is providing new avenues for hope and political leverage. The situation has also placed Israel in a delicate position. Israeli leaders have dismissed the Chinese and Russian statements as politically motivated, accusing both powers of exploiting the crisis for their own strategic goals. Nevertheless, the fact that two permanent members of the UN Security Council have taken such strong positions complicates Israel's diplomatic strategy. With China and Russia both wielding veto power at the Security Council, any attempt by Western nations to push through resolutions favorable to Israel will likely face stiff resistance. Meanwhile, regional powers are recalibrating their stances. Turkey, long a vocal supporter of Palestinian rights, has welcomed the involvement of China and Russia. Iran has also expressed approval, seeing in their statements a reinforcement of its own position. Even Saudi Arabia, traditionally cautious in its diplomacy, has begun to shift its tone, with officials calling for stronger international action to end the violence. The convergence of voices from the East, combined with mounting protests in Western capitals, suggests that global opinion is tilting toward a more balanced approach, or at least a more contested diplomatic landscape. The humanitarian dimension cannot be overlooked. The United Nations has warned that Gaza is on the brink of collapse. Food supplies are dwindling, fuel reserves are almost exhausted, and hospitals are stretched beyond capacity. Children are among the hardest hit, with UNICEF reporting alarming numbers of injuries, malnutrition, and psychological trauma. International aid agencies have appealed for immediate access to deliver humanitarian relief, but ongoing military operations have made this difficult. In this context, China and Russia's calls for an immediate ceasefire and humanitarian corridors resonate strongly with international audiences. Beyond the immediate crisis, the geopolitical implications are enormous. The Middle East has long been a stage for global rivalry, from the Cold War to the present day. The re-entry of Russia into the region's diplomacy, alongside China's growing economic footprint through projects like the Belt and Road Initiative, signals a potential new era of multipolar influence. For Washington, this development poses a challenge. The U.S. has invested decades in cultivating its role as the main broker in Middle East peace processes, yet its credibility has eroded in the eyes of many. If Beijing and Moscow succeed in positioning themselves as credible alternatives, the balance of power in the region could shift dramatically. Domestically, both China and Russia are leveraging their bold statements to reinforce their own narratives. In China, state media has highlighted Beijing's call for justice as evidence of its role as a responsible global leader, contrasting it with what it portrays as Western indifference. In Russia, the government is using the Palestinian issue to rally support both at home and abroad, particularly among nations critical of U.S. foreign policy. By framing themselves as champions of the oppressed, both governments are seeking to expand their influence in Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East regions, where support for Palestine has historically been strong. Reactions in Washington and European capitals have been cautious. U.S. officials have criticized China and Russia for what they describe as opportunistic behavior, accusing them of exploiting the crisis for geopolitical gain rather than genuinely seeking peace. At the same time, Western diplomats privately acknowledge that the growing role of Beijing and Moscow complicates their ability to control the narrative. European leaders, facing large-scale protests in their own cities, are under pressure to adopt a more balanced position. Already, some governments are hinting at recognizing Palestinian statehood, a move that could reshape the diplomatic landscape. The future of the crisis remains uncertain. While the entry of China and Russia has added new momentum to international calls for peace, it has also raised the stakes. With multiple powers now vying for influence, the chances of a coordinated response may diminish. The United Nations, despite repeated appeals, remains paralyzed by division among its members. Civil society groups, humanitarian organizations, and ordinary citizens are left to bear the brunt of inaction, as lives continue to be lost on the ground. Observers warn that the crisis could serve as a turning point in international relations. If China and Russia succeed in creating a coalition of nations demanding Palestinian statehood and an end to the occupation, it could mark the beginning of a new global alignment. For decades, the world has been dominated by Western-led institutions and norms. The Palestinian issue, long a symbol of injustice for much of the global South, may now become the rallying point for an alternative order. At the same time, the risks of escalation are real. Israel, feeling increasingly isolated, may double down on its military strategy, while Palestinian groups, emboldened by international support, may intensify their resistance. Regional actors like Iran, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia could be drawn deeper into the conflict, raising the risk of a wider confrontation. And with great powers like China, Russia, and the United States all directly involved in the diplomatic struggle, the potential for miscalculation looms large. For ordinary Palestinians, the high-level diplomacy matters less than the immediate reality of survival. Families are struggling to find food, parents are searching for lost children, and communities are trying to hold together amid the rubble of destroyed homes. For them, the question is not about global power shifts, but about whether they will make it through the night, whether their children will be safe, and whether the world will act before it is too late. The unfolding events in Palestine have already reshaped the conversation about justice, sovereignty, and the balance of power. With China and Russia stepping in with bold statements, the crisis has officially turned global. What happens next will not only determine the fate of Palestinians and Israelis, but also the future of international diplomacy itself. The world is watching closely, waiting to see whether this moment leads to renewed hope for peace or deeper divisions that could echo for generations to come.